I think the one big message that sociology teaches us about COVID is that structure matters. And what I mean by that is the built environment that we live in, the communities that we're in, the cities that we're in, the rural areas that we're in, shapes and impacts the way that our community was responding to COVID and the way that COVID disproportionately impacted certain communities. So structural conditions really bring to bear how we think about urbanicity, how we think about people's access to public transport, people's access to healthcare facilities. And we could think about how all of those have played a role in the way that COVID has kind of spilled over into our lives. I think the most relevant sociological findings that people should know as it relates to COVID is that there are illness spillovers of COVID-19. Yes, of course, we know that we are approaching roughly 1 million people in the United States alone that have died from COVID-19. And people, even to this day, continue to contract the virus, even if cases have plummeted and also vaccinations have increased. But these COVID-19 spillovers have spilled over into learning, the way that college students are impacted by COVID-19. There are some individuals who for 2 years, particularly if you think about graduating from high school and going to college, have not really been able to experience in classroom learning in ways that were normal, meaning pre-pandemic. We can also think about the impact that COVID-19 is having on children, say in preschool and K through 12th grade, and particularly elementary school during these formative years. But then there are other ways. Obviously, we could think about the impact that COVID-19 has had on work, people's opportunity to work, who's had the ability to work from home versus not, who's had the ability to continue making the same amount of money they made before, if not more, and then who has been shut out of, say, certain opportunities to gain certain resources as it relates to COVID-19. Of course, I'm talking about funding from the Small Business Administration for the Payment Protection Program. So these illness spillovers of police violence really impacts us, particularly when we start to even say, look at the role of race and class, where research documents that Blacks and Latinos are much more likely to have died from COVID and are more likely to know someone who's passed away and have also contracted the virus. So these illness spillovers, sociology really highlights the way that COVID-19, not just as a pandemic is impacting us, but how we have multiple pandemics impacting us simultaneously. I think when it comes to thinking about my own research at the University of Maryland, where I direct the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, as well as being a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., is that we have really been focusing on these illness spillovers. One of the big things I'll highlight is a report that I conducted looking at COVID-19 in Detroit. We could think about Detroit, Michigan as part of this great migration north, particularly that Black Americans went on from the South as they were trying to find better work opportunities, but also fleeing lynching in the early part of the 20th century. And they went up through Chicago and Gary and St. Louis and Baltimore and Philadelphia and Detroit. So these cities are emblematic of one another. And one of the biggest things we found in Detroit is the way that individuals had less access to healthcare. And when I say less access, not only is that in terms of proximity, but also when they actually seeked out certain types of healthcare, whether that be COVID-19 testing very early on or treatment in terms of not only vaccinations, but going to a hospital. And one of the detrimental things we found was that Black people were about 6 times more likely to be turned away from COVID-19 testing and treatment. And then Black people, along with Latinos, were much more likely to work in these frontline essential jobs that oftentimes afford people like me, even potentially people like us, the ability to work from home and get everything brought to us. So these were cooks, these were construction workers, these were delivery drivers, these were factory workers. And we can look at these frontline jobs, even beyond thinking about the impact that it's had on healthcare professionals, is that these illness spillovers of COVID-19 have really impacted people. And then, of course, we can not only think about COVID-19, but we have to think about more broadly about what I'm highlighting, which is the role of systemic racism. And so a lot of my work focuses on that, and more importantly, how we can address certain disparities. I've been doing a lot of work on policing, particularly at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, where we partner with Google to develop a virtual reality training program for law enforcement. And I think this is some of the cutting edge work that sociology brings to bear, where it's merging different sorts of disciplines, where it's thinking in innovative ways about experimentation, about how we bring in qualitative research and quantitative measures. And collectively, we tend to think that this work is going to help to improve our society as a whole. I think when it comes to thinking about sociological research and its impact, yes, I think there is a lot of work coming out, not just in some of the top mainstream journals like the American Sociological Review, but even in, say, Context magazine, Sociology for the Public, which is sponsored by the American Sociological Association and is considered one of the public faces of ASA. And I just happen to be one of the co-editors with Fabio Rojas. And in this particular outlet, it's a magazine that looks like any magazine that you would get. It's all flashy and looks great, but it is academic research, primarily sociological research, where it takes a 9 or 10,000 word article that someone might have published, and all of a sudden people create 3,000 word pieces or 1,000 word pieces that are more accessible to the public, as well as focusing on policy. And one of the things that we did early on during the pandemic is we issued a call to not just sociologists, but all academics, saying if you are doing work on the pandemic, on COVID-19, send us what we called your sociological gold. People sent in articles. We were just bombarded with submissions. We had submissions from over 20 countries around the world, and we published a special issue on pandemics, not just on COVID-19, but also on lessons learned from other pandemics, and then looking in the future, ways that these sort of things can be addressed. So I think that there's tons of sociological research. We also know that sociologists are starting to think more broadly about what it means to engage publicly with society, writing opinion editorials, writing policy briefs. And I think these are the places where sociology should be. It's not necessarily our job to tell people what they should do and necessarily what they should think, but what we hope is to guide people with the information that they use to make the informed decisions about what they should do, what they should think, and how they should feel about different situations. And I think right now, sociologists are really doing that in a big way. I think when it comes to thinking about the way COVID-19 is going to impact sociologists moving forward, is that it's here. And I think we're going to be studying it. We're not only going to be studying it in the now, but we're going to be studying it in the future. If it is supposedly a future, I tend to think that based on the research, that this is something that we're going to be living with in some way. So part of what sociologists are going to be looking at are certain trends, these broad trends when it comes to structure, when it comes to culture. Of course, there's been a big debate politically in terms of how we think about masks, how we think about vaccination. But I also know that the other way that COVID-19 is impacting sociologists is in terms of how we conduct our research, particularly for qualitative scholars, for people who are collecting data, for ethnographers, and even in the classroom in terms of how we teach. I tend to think, hopefully at the end of the day, it'll be a positive with us bringing in more technology, us bringing in more innovation beyond just the traditional ways that we might stand up in front of people and lecture. Students are pushing us to require something different. And I think that sociologists are coming up and raising up to the occasion. I think when it comes to the news media and the way that the news media frames sociology, is one of the biggest things I noticed is that rarely are sociologists given credit for what we're actually doing. They might highlight an individual scholar. They might say that an academic study did this, but rarely will they frame it as sociology. And I've actually seen it. And it's happened to me quite a bit in an annoying way, where they won't even call us sociologists. They might call us something different. And I think for sociologists, we have to think more directly and concretely about saying that we are sociologists, saying that what we do we look at the impact that society has on individuals and the influence that individuals have on society, particularly in terms of thinking about the way that individuals feel, think, and behave in society and the role that social institutions play. So I think sociologists, we also have a job to ensure that we call ourselves sociologists, that we anoint ourselves as such. And in doing so, I think we'll continue to see sociology get out into the public framework and into the public discourse. And when that happens, we'll start to hear people not just talking sociologically, because we hear that all the time, but people saying that that is coming from a sociological viewpoint, which is slightly different from, I think, what is happening now. So that's one of the biggest things I've been seeing in the media as a person who does a lot of that, is I'll look up and never once did someone mention sociologists, never once did someone mention sociology unless I did it myself. And I think that is one of the things we have to think about as scholars.